Hi, this is The Philosophical Angle, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I am the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is The Nature of Aesthetics. Another one is Defining Ethics, Good and Evil. The purpose of The Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of the concepts being used in current media and compare the essence of the concept with the usage and circumstances in which it's being used. This week, we're going to discuss an article from the Wall Street Journal of September 5th, 2013, entitled, "Would Bombing Syria Be a Just War?" It's by Robert P. George. And the subtitle of the article is, "Gene Elfstein believed it is America's duty to respond to the cries of the aggrieved." Let's begin. I'm going to read some passages from this article, and then we're going to discuss it. Gene Elfstein, the eminent University of Chicago scholar who died last month at age 72, was a little lady from a small town in Colorado who became a giant in the field of political philosophy. She embraced religious faith, in the end becoming a Catholic. Defying the radical feminism of the 1970s, she rejected abortion as the taking of innocent human life and defended marriage as normative for sexual conduct. All of her academic heresies, however, none was more upsetting to Elfstein's colleagues than her support for aggressive military action against terrorist organizations, and a decade ago, her defense of the war in Iraq. Elfstein insisted that America's conflict with Al-Qaeda was not a matter of international law enforcement, as some insisted. It was a war. Terrorists and states that support them are not merely engaged in criminal activities. They are our enemies. In the same way that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were our enemies in World War II. As she wrote in her 2003 book, Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World. She said, quote, "With our great power comes an even greater responsibility. One of our ongoing responsibilities is to respond to the cries of the aggrieved. Victims of genocide, for example, have a reasonable expectation that powerful nations devoted to human rights will attempt to stay the hand of the murderers," unquote from the book. Next paragraph in the article here in the Wall Street Journal. Elfstein was a believer in and a leading interpreter of the tradition known as just war theory. This view that the use of force is inherently unjustifiable. Just war theory says that in the face of unjust aggression, nations sometimes have a duty to use military force. They are also obliged or obligated to fight with all legitimate means to win, to defeat the enemy and halt its aggression. Elfstein's view of war was that any military action should be about advancing the common good and establishing principles of justice and human rights. Who could disagree? She recognized that a powerful and prosperous nation bears great moral responsibilities that transcend its borders. For just war theorists, it means that we should, working with other freedom-loving nations where possible, do what we can in a prudent manner to prevent mass murder by those George W. Bush accurately described after the 9/11 terror attacks as evildoers. Elstein recognized, however, as have just war theorists going back to St. Augustine, though, that modern popes, that even when force is used in a just cause, there are additional requirements that must be met. Critically, in the current debate, these include the likelihood of improving and not worsening the situation for the people of Syria and other potential victims of undeterred tyrants or violent extremists. Any concern is proportionality, the requirement that the collateral damage inevitably caused by the use of force not be so great as to render the use of force disproportionate and unfair to the innocent. Lastly, these judgments in any particular case will depend on careful empirical assessments of the facts. The sin, either way, is cynicism, defined here as the failure to treat politics and war as a morally serious business. And lastly, Professor George is a professor of jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, who wrote that article that we just discussed here in the Wall Street Journal. So now let's go back and let's outline what was said here and then see if we can make some sense of this. Okay, the article headline, should U.S. go to war against Syria? Well, the article says we must halt aggression. The U.S. has a moral responsibility, being a leader in the world. We must fight against evildoers such as terrorists who came at us at 9/11. We can use force, and we must use it if we're at war, and if the war is a just cause. And just cause being, examples would be common good, justice, and the establishment of human rights. Who could argue? Also, when we use the use of force, we must have improvement of the condition of proportionality, meaning you don't want it to be unfair and you don't want to cause too much collateral damage. It's got to be proportionate to the cause. It mentions just war theory. Well, just war theory came from, as the article said, St. Augustine. But it later also, St. Thomas Aquinas also added to that. Augustine said that we need to protect the peace and punish wickedness. Just as the article said, we must fight against evildoers. Augustine, to really sum it up, said, it's really peace versus sin. So, if you've got sin, what do you do about it? Do you fight against it? Do you just sit back and ignore it? So, and this is the part where proportionality comes in. You have to risk both sides. You have to weigh both sides. To have your peace, yet you want to fight against sin. Later, St. Thomas Aquinas, he brought in the proper authority, that is a legitimate government, an example. And he brought in that it must be good and a just use of force, and that the motive must be peaceful. In other words, after your war, you want to You have made that huge sacrifice, and really the ultimate goal of that huge sacrifice is peace. Kind of reminds you of the ancient Roman orator who said, if you want peace, get ready for war. So from both of these scholars and philosophers, the Catholic just war theory emerged. So, when is war justifiable? Well, the Catholic just war theory can be broken down into the just caused, again, going back to St. Thomas Aquinas, comparable justice. In other words, if there's lots of injustice on the other side, mass killings like Pol Pot, killing 60% of his population, intervention is justified. As both Augustine and Aquinas would agree. Competent authority, okay, we just covered that. Legitimate government, right intent. Naturally, you want peace at the end, as the philosophers have noted, and that success is probable. Right. You can't go in with an impossible task before you. Talk fails. All negotiations break down. Nothing can be further from negotiations. Proportionality, in other words, as we already said, collateral damage can't be too great. If you go in and try to rectify the situation and cause everybody to die, obviously that ruins the proportionality rule of the just war theory. So let's get back to something said in the article. It was said here that you need an empirical assessment. Well, easier said than done, I would say. How do you make an empirical assessment of all these philosophical kind of ingredients going on? How would you know? Moral responsibility, evildoers, just cause. Yet it states empirical assessment. How do we do that? How do we measure this? Not an easy task, but you're with the philosophical angle, so we're going to give it the old college try. The way to do that is to analyze the decision. In other words, they're giving the criteria to make a decision. So how does a person make a decision? That would be the start. Well, you make a decision because every time you're faced with something that you have to decide, it's basically a sacrifice against a reward. Everything you do, you're sacrificing your time, your effort, your material, you're using your knowledge, and you're doing it amidst an atmosphere of risk. So this sacrifice, you sacrifice these items in order to obtain the object of your sacrifice. We'll call it a reward. In this case, for example, in turmoil in Syria, you would want to bring peace. So your reward would be peace here. So how do we quantify, again, needing our empirical assessment? You quantify it because within these ingredients, there is something called cooperation. Cooperation is effort and knowledge and risk in order to produce something. So we sacrifice, and when we make our decision to get a reward, we also face the problem of ethics. Is it ethical? Is it good? Shall we do it? Well, so the core of ethics, the nature of ethics, is the appropriate dispensation of respect. And when we are cooperating with somebody else, when we meet somebody else in the street and we're about to make a decision, if we give that person the appropriate amount of respect, you're being ethical to that person. And we are respectful to that person because we want to cooperate with him, which is a just cause. So giving others their respectful due is a form of justice. And we cooperate because we consider the other important in our lives. And they're important because they're a part of our life in some way. And that way would be we're producing good. And when people cooperate within a country, they're producing goods and services to allow themselves to bring themselves up away from misery, which is the basis of all that is good. So let's recap this slightly, briefly. Ethics is the appropriate dispensation of respect. We respect others. That this aspect of human nature, the respect, allows us to cooperate. And cooperation is done in order to produce something, in other words, to attain a reward. And we produce rewards which are such as goods and services, and not only corporately for a real good or service that like is sold at stores, but social goods and services, such as being cooperative with your wife to produce children that will succeed you. So we produce at all levels to bring us up away from misery, to make our lives better, to do the best we can, which is good. So, still, we haven't answered yet quite the empirical assessment of how do we approach another nation and whether we should go to war with it. If there's all sorts of evildoers and lots of injustice, as the theory indicates we need. Well, we can, because we can take it as a guideline, our economic transaction. Not only do all decisions, but economic decisions have the same ingredients. When we produce something, a good or a service, we produce it in an atmosphere of risk, using our knowledge, effort, and material to produce that good or service. And that reward from doing that sacrifice is our profit. And so if we add up all the goods and services in a nation that the nation is producing, it's an indicator of the amount of cooperation that's going on in the nation, and thus is actually an indication of the amount of freedom, at least economic freedom, allowing the individuals to produce a lot of good. So if there's a lot of good going on in the nation, being produced by its cooperation of economic transactions, you can pretty well rest assured that the nation is doing well and people are happy. Obviously, then no war is needed. So if we take this as a yardstick, we can approach countries and understand whether there is a just war to be had here. Because within this ethical analysis, all these ingredients are present. The just cause, it's within the concept of cooperation. Comparable justice, it's within the concept of respect. Competent authority, the government or the nation in which this is happening. The right intent, good, we're producing services and goods to bring ourselves up away from misery. Definitely good, definitely right intent. Success is probable. Well, and every time you do, you cooperate to produce something. Before you do it, you have to make an assessment of the risk that this will be successful, that your reward will come to fruition. So you make that assessment of risk. So if you're producing a lot of goods and services, the success is probable. Talk fails. When talk fails, you don't have cooperation. Proportionality. Collateral damage. That goes back here to the production. If it's a success, most likely your collateral damage is not so great. So how do we apply it to Syria? Well, I think that going to war in Syria would probably violate the proportionality. I mean, after all, who's good there? Inside there, you've got lots of injustice, but they're all the organizations are really inimical to the ends of the United States. They are not our friends. The Russians are there, so your proportionality is not really, I think, is violated, because it could lead into a third world war. So in conclusion, I think invading Syria is the wrong idea, not only on many levels. And that's my conclusion. And I want to thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next week on The Philosophical Angle.